Okay, hello everyone. So we will start space complexity. So till now, so some of you, I think all of you might have seen uh, space complexity, even a tiny bit of space complexity at least in your undergrad, or if you're already undergrad in your second year. So the thing is, till now, our focus has always been on time-bounded computation, and this is what people focus on during algorithms, or then you study algorithms, right? However, there are complexity classes based on space-bounded computation as well, right? So today we will, or for the next few lectures, we'll see about space-bounded computation. So the main complexity classes that we'll see are L and NL, which L stands for log space. This is the complexity class that uses logarithmic space, and NL is the non-deterministic equivalent of them. And P space is the complexity class that takes polynomial space, right? So we'll see this in due course, right? So before even getting into that, what is the space usage of a Turing machine, right? So the thing is, the natural way to, or the one obvious starting point that everyone may think is how much space does you suppose you have a deterministic Turing machine, let's say one tape Turing machine, how much space does a computation take? And that is the space usage. This notion is okay, but it has a certain issue. Meaning, let's say the input is recorded in the first n slots of the tape cells. Now, the Turing machine may need extra space or may not need extra space, but for sure we need to use this much space, n bits or n symbols to in the tape to encode the input, right? By definition, n is the length of the input, right? So the total space usage is the space taken for storing the input, which may or may not be overwritten during the algorithm, and then if required, extra space, right? So this is the total space, sometimes we denote it by S of n, right? However, the problem with this model is that S of n has to be necessarily more than n, the length of the input. But we will see examples where computation can be performed in lesser time. So why should we penalize, or why should we count the space required for the input towards the total space usage? Maybe we should not be counting that space, right? Indeed, there are algorithms. If you don't count the input space, the extra space used is only, let's say, logarithmic in the input size, right? So this once you have this idea, then we realize that this particular model of counting the space is not ideal. So we want to move to a model where the space used by the input should not be counted. So we'll have to change the model a bit. So what we do is we create a separate work tape where we do the work. The input tape is read-only, which means the input tape has the input and it is a read-only tape. So you cannot perform any write operations. So you cannot do any calculations there. You can only read from whatever is there, and that cannot be changed. The work tape is the actual working space. This is a read-write tape. And the third tape is an output tape. This is usually not required. So when we are dealing with decision problems, meaning when we have seen languages and membership in languages, right? So is this formula satisfiable? Does this graph have a cake leak? All that kind of thing. It's a yes/no answer. So the machine just accepts or rejects. So we don't need the output tape. But suppose we are computing a function, let's say given x, you are computing f of x. Perhaps the function could be a mathematical function. Perhaps it could be, let's say, a reduction function. Let's say you want to reduce from an instance of problem A to a problem B or whatever. In that case, the output is not a yes/no output, accept reject output. It could be another string. In that case, we have an output tape, and even the space that is used by the output tape is not counted towards the space usage of the machine. The output tape is a write-only tape, so you cannot read from there. So you cannot do any rewrite, or you cannot do anything like that. So you just write, and that's it. Once a particular bit is finalized or a particular symbol is finalized, you just write it. So that's what the output tape is for. So all the work happens in the middle tape, the work tape, and that is the space that is counted. So this is a space, the space used in the work tape as a function of n is the space complexity. So if you look at CIPSR, which is what I use to prepare these notes, there is a more formal definition of the same thing. And this is the definition for a deterministic Turing machine. The space used is the space used by the work tape. In case the machine is non-deterministic, the space complexity is the maximum out of any branch of computation. So the non-deterministic Turing machine, there could be several possible branches of computation. So the space complexity of a non-deterministic Turing machine is the maximum out of all those branches, right? Just like the time complexity of a non-deterministic Turing machine. So if there are multiple branches, the time complexity is the maximum out of any computation branch. Okay, so just like we had d time, time, etc., space of Fn, or sometimes d space of Fn, is the complexity class consisting of all the decision problems or all the languages that can be decided by a deterministic Turing machine that takes order Fn space. Okay, space of Fn is the, or d space of Fn is this. All the languages that can be decided by a deterministic order Fn space Turing machine. Similarly, n space of Fn is this class of all languages that can be decided by an order Fn space non-deterministic Turing machine. So yeah, and so very quickly, two exercises which should be interesting. It's not difficult at all. It's very straightforward. So we saw that 3-sat is NP complete, right? So but surprisingly, you can check that it's very straightforward to check the 3-sat is in D space of n. So when we measure the space usage, or if you're measuring the space usage, there is a way to use only linear space and still decide 3-sat. Okay, so this machine, as we all know, we don't expect or we don't hope to have a polynomial time algorithm for 3-sat, but surprisingly, when you look at it from the perspective of space, linear space is sufficient, right? So that is exercise 1. Exercise 2 is even simpler. So given palindrome, an instance of palindrome. So palindrome means the set of all strings that reads the same way from right to left and left to right. So the class palindrome is in D space of log n, right? It's in deterministic space log n, right? Okay, so D space n means order n space. This also means order log n space, right? So surprising, this is still interesting. Like, so when you solve it, the algorithm is very simple, but still it's somewhat surprising when you see it in this perspective. Okay. Now definition, we say log space, or the class log space, sometimes denoted by the letter L, is just nothing but D space of log n. So all the class of all the problems or languages that can be decided by an order log n space deterministic Turing machine, and NL, which is short for non-deterministic log space, is n space of log n. Right. Now let us see some standard relations between D space, N space, and D time, etc. Okay. So we have already seen D time, we have already seen N space, we have already seen D space. How are they related to each other? Right. First result is not very difficult. D space of Fn is contained in N space of Fn for any function f. This is trivial because non-deterministic space Turing, any deterministic Turing machine is also you can view it as a non-deterministic Turing machine that does not use any choices, right? So that's why this is true. This is trivial. So anything that can be computed by a deterministic Turing machine can be certainly computed by a non-deterministic Turing machine with the same space constraints. So when you set Fn equal to log n, you get L is contained in NL, which is again trivial to see. Theorem 2, and one statement to note is that most of the time when we talk about space requirement in this particular let's say entire chapter or section, not just this lecture, but whenever we are talking about space requirement, usually when we talk of d space Fn, right, we will implicitly assume that Fn is at least log n, unless it is explicitly noted that Fn is something smaller, right? You can assume that Fn is at least log n because even to do something like the input is of n bits. So even to look at like kind of say that you are at position I of the input, right? You need some kind of counter or something like that. And that counter requires logarithmic size in n. So there is hardly anything that you may be able to do if the space is below log n. So it is a reasonable assumption to make that Fn is always at least log n. Okay, so this is something that we'll be assuming throughout unless it is mentioned otherwise. Then d time of Fn is contained in d space of Fn. Again, this is also very easy to see because d time of Fn is the deterministic Turing machine that runs in time Fn. So if you have a deterministic Turing machine that runs in time Fn, the head can move at most order Fn steps. And if it moves at most order Fn steps, it can write at most order Fn locations. So it is going to use at most order Fn tape locations. So the total space usage is also order Fn. Hence, the d time machine itself is a d space Fn machine. That's why that's how this inclusion follows. Next thing, n time Fn. So we saw that d time Fn is in d space Fn very easily. Surprisingly, even n time Fn is in d space Fn. Right? So this is slightly more interesting. So even if you have non-deterministic time Fn, it is contained in deterministic space Fn. Why is this the case? Right. So there is a computation tree that I have drawn. So suppose this is the consider a language L that is in n time Fn, right? Now consider a language L that is in n time Fn. So that means it has a non-deterministic Turing machine that accepts that language or that decides that language in time order Fn. So now look at the computation tree of the non-deterministic Turing machine. So given any input, there is a computation tree. And what we know is that if the string is in the language, there is an accepting path. If the string is not in the language, all paths are rejected. Right? So what the D-space machine will do is to kind of simulate this non-deterministic Turing machine that places the language in this class. So this particular simulation can be done in order Fn space. But the D-space machine is a deterministic machine, so you cannot magically explore all the paths together. So how does it do it? So we don't need to do a we don't need to actually use non-determinism. We could just explore each path one by one, each path from the root to the leaf. So let us say the maximum branching at any point is, let's say, 10. Okay, just for the sake of simplicity, let's say 10. In that case, the number of leaves will be 10 power the height of the tree, right? Number of leaves will be 10 power the height of the tree. So which means each leaf has a path, each leaf has a kind of label that corresponds, of which is a string of ranging from 0 to 10 power fn. Basically, each leaf can be denoted by a string of length order fn. So I just note whether I move what is the branching here. Did I go to the first branch, second branch, third branch, and so on? And over here, do I move to the first branch, second branch, third branch, and so on? And so basically, if I keep track of the branchings that I did at each step, I can get a string that tells me the identity of the leaf, and this is a unique string for each leaf. So that string encodes the path that you took from the root to reach that leaf. And what is the length of that string? It is order fn, the same as the height. Now, if I tell you that this is the path that I followed, now you could, the deterministic Turing machine could just, let's say I tell you 0, 1, 1, 1, 0, 1 something, the string corresponding to a particular leaf, then the deterministic Turing machine will just exactly make those choices 0, 1, 1, 1, 1, whatever, and reach the leaf and see what is the outcome. And then it can go and compute the next string, right? So what we need to do is compute, the deterministic Turing machine will go to each of these leaves and check what is the outcome. So how does it go to each of these leaves? I could just have a counter of length order fn, and I will increment the counter from all zeros to whatever the maximum is. And for each of these counters, I will check if there is a path corresponding to that counter, and if there is such a path, is it an accepting path or is it a rejecting path? If any of the leaves corresponds to an accepting computation, we accept the string. If all paths are rejecting, we reject the string. So we need to just simulate this machine, the non-deterministic Turing machine, which runs in order fn time. But to do that, we need keep track of this counter that for all that checks whether we are in leaf 1, leaf 2, and so on. So for that counter, we require order fn space. And even for the simulating the NTM itself, the non-deterministic Turing machine itself, we need to use order fn space, because that non-deterministic Turing machine will, to simulate that, we require some space that corresponds to the head of the non-deterministic Turing machine, right? So that's how we get, so both the simulation and the counter require order fn space. Hence, using order fn plus order fn, which is still order fn, deterministic space, you can simulate a non-deterministic Turing machine. Right. So we saw that d space fn is contained in n space fn, d time fn is contained in d space fn, and interestingly, n time fn is also contained in d space fn. Next, let us consider the relation between d space. How is it contained in d time? So deterministic Turing machine that takes space fn is contained in deterministic Turing machine that takes time 2 power order fn. Let's see why this is. What is the number of configurations of the d space machine? Okay, by what do I mean by a configuration? What I mean is, right, so there is a tape for the d space machine. The input is fixed, right? The work tape, and the work tape has order fn length, right? And so there could be sigma symbols, many symbols that could be in the first location, second location, and so on. So this work tape can contain possibly sigma power fn patterns or sigma power order fn patterns. And you have to consider the head that corresponds to this tape. The head could be in anywhere of these order fn locations. That is this fn. There is also a head that corresponds to the input tape that could be in any of these n locations. And then there is the state, the inherent state of the Turing machine that is written here by the number q. So simplifying, you get that this is 2 power order fn times n times fn, and q is a constant that just depends on the Turing machine. It is independent of the input length n. Right? So I write q as order 1, and now I also use that fn is at least log n. So n is also something that can be written as 2 power log n, which is dominated by 2 power order fn, since fn is at least log n. And fn is also dominated by 2 power ofn, so everything gets absorbed in this. So this means the number of configurations that capture the entire state, including the state of the Turing machine, tape contents, head positions, everything. The number of that is 2 power order fn. And again, this is just a reminder, we'll always be making this assumption that fn is at least log n. So the d-time machine, so the goal is d space fn can be contained in d-time order fn. So basically what the d-time machine will do is to start from the starting configuration of d space machine and simulate the d space machine. So it starts from the d space machine and goes to the next. So once it simulates, it knows what is the next state. It goes to the next state. And then it goes to the next state. It's a deterministic machine, so there is a natural successor, unique successor to each state, until it reaches accept or reject. What if it loops, right? The point is that since there are 2 power, there is an upper bound on the number of configurations, it needs to run this computation only for 2 power order fn steps on the configuration graph of the NTM, of the, not NTM, D space machine. Sorry, I'll just, of the D-time machine can run serially. So basically it just starts with the configuration. Maybe I'll just draw a small picture here. This is the starting configuration of the D space machine, then it goes to next, then it goes to next, then it goes to next, and so on. And you stop when you reach an accepting configuration or rejecting configuration, in which case you know what the outcome is, or you run till order fn steps, at which point you know that if you are looping, you will just be repeatedly going to some state again and again. So if your total number of steps has exceeded the number of configurations, you can just stop the entire process. So each circle here corresponds to a configuration, and the D-time machine just moves from the first configuration and computes over the next configuration and so on. And so the number of steps that it needs to make is 2 power order fn steps. So the D-time machine takes 2 power order fn steps. So we get this result that D space of fn is contained in D-time 2 power order fn. So setting fn is equal to log n, we get that D space of log n is L, and D-time of 2 power order fn is D-time of 2 power order log n. 2 power order log n is n power constant, which is polynomial. So this is D-time of polynomial is just the class P. So when we set fn is equal to log n here, you get L is contained in P. So the class log space is contained in polynomial time. Right? So I want you to think of all these things, right? So non-deterministic log space is contained in non-deterministic. Okay, so this is so this already tells us that D space of something is contained in N space. This is easy. So polynomial time is contained in polynomial space if you set fn as polynomial. This says that non-deterministic polynomial time is also contained in polynomial space. And in fact, the exercise actually asks you to do that SAT, which is in non-deterministic polynomial time, is in linear space. So that's a specific problem, but in general, non-deterministic polynomial time is contained in polynomial space. So without deterministic polynomial space, not even, right? So we don't need non-determinism here. Here also we don't need non-determinism. And yeah, we will see more interesting aspects of polynomial space later. I don't want to confuse you all the more now. And this means that deterministic polynomial space is contained in, or deterministic log space is contained in polynomial time, and deterministic polynomial space is contained in exponential time, right? So if you write, if fn is substituted to be a polynomial, this becomes exponential time because you have 2 power polynomial. And now we'll see that this result holds even if the left hand side is non-deterministic fn space. So this is true for deterministic fn space and non-deterministic fn space as well. So even if this is non-deterministic, this is true. So the number of configurations is still the same because this calculation did not use any deterministic or non-deterministic things. But what about this proof is using the fact that it is deterministic? Where we use deterministic is at this place, that every configuration has a unique successor. In the case of a non-deterministic machine or an n-space machine, I'm sorry, there is a typo here, okay, which I will erase and fix. So in fact, I think what I had originally written was correct, but this is better, right? So where did we use non-deterministic deterministic space, deterministic, the fact that this machine is deterministic here, the fact that every configuration has a unique successor. But we can still do the same thing even without this, right? So we cannot follow this proof because every configuration does not have the unique successor, right? So, but then if it is a tree, right, every configuration has many successors, right? Let's say there is a branching factor of b. So then you may branch so many places, and the running time is 2 power order fn, you may just be somewhere. So how do you know whether you are looping, whether you are doing things correctly, right? It's a non-deterministic machine. So let us make a graph which is commonly called the configuration graph of the n-space machine. Let us make a graph like this. This is a configuration. So this is starting configuration, grad 1, and these are the successor configurations. Now we are at a non-deterministic Turing machine, so we will have multiple successors possibly. And for each such configuration, I will have multiple further successors. And for each such configuration, I will have multiple further successors and so on. Right? Maybe I need to draw some, right? Now, right, so and so on. And there is one accepting state, again denoted by red. Now, what we need to do is to check whether there is a path from this starting configuration to this accepting configuration. There is a valid path from this way. If there is a valid path, then that is a valid path for the n-space machine, right? And then that will lead to it being accepted. So all that we need to do is, in this configuration graph, we need to check whether there is a path from this node to this node. And what is the number of nodes in the configuration graph? It is a number of configurations. What is the number of configurations? We earlier calculated in the previous theorem. It is 2 power order fn. Right? It is 2 power order fn. So the number of vertices in this graph is 2 power order fn, and we need to check whether there is a path from here to here. Okay, what does this remind you of? How do we check, given a graph, how do you check or given a directed graph, how do you check whether there is a path from vertex A to vertex B? We could use standard traversal techniques like breadth first search or depth first search. And this takes V plus E time, where V is the number of vertices and E is the number of edges. But number of edges is at most number of vertices squared, right? Or maybe, yeah, number of vertices squared. So this runs in order V squared time the worst case, but where V is the number of vertices. We know the number of vertices is the number of configurations, which is this. Even if there is a square, it just gets absorbed, this power 2 gets absorbed into this O, because O is the, and even this outside O notation can be absorbed within this exponent O. The O hides a constant in the exponent, and that can, the constant here is much worse than a constant over here. So we could just remove this outside O as well. So this is this much time, and if it can run in this much time, we will say that it is in order 2 power order Fn time, right? Which is what we say here. So all we do is you search whether there is a path from C star to C accept in this graph, right? So one thing to note is that we don't explicitly write down this graph anywhere. We don't have to pre-compute this graph, right? This is something that you may be thinking. The algorithm does not draw this entire graph and then search for a path. What it needs to do is to implicitly search for a path in this graph. So whenever it is at a certain node, it can simulate the n space machine. It can say this is the input, this is the configuration, this is the work tape, this is the head location, etc. What is the next configuration? And then it knows the next configuration, and then, or what are the next configurations possible. The transition function of the non-deterministic space Turing machine will tell you the next spaces possible. And now let's say if there are, let's say, 10 options for the next configuration, it can say that it can have an ordering, which is the first successor, second successor, and so on. It could index the branches. So let's say let us say that this is a particular configuration and there are several possible successor configurations. The machine could index 1, 2, 3, 4 as the, or if there are 4 configurations, 4 successor configurations, it could index them as 1, 2, 3, 4. It could have some implicit lexicographic ordering or something, and it could first explore this path, and so on. So this keeping track can be done by a depth first search. So it does not have to draw this entire configuration graph to begin with, but it will implicitly keep track of this. And anyway, we are not bothered about the space in the case of the time machine, but we are bothered about the time. So we need to have some tracking mechanism, which is anyway there in any depth first search or breadth first search. At every node, we have to keep track of that, right? Right. So I was just observing the point that we don't need to generate this thing before going ahead. So now we have, when we plug in log n here, we get that non-deterministic log space is contained in polynomial time. So earlier we saw that deterministic log space is contained in polynomial time. Even non-deterministic log space is contained in polynomial time. Fine. I'll just pause for a second. Okay, so now let us consider the language path. So what is the language path? It is a directed graph G with 2 vertices S and T. And this consists of, we are asking whether G has a path from S to T. It's a directed graph, meaning the edges have directions. The edges are directed. So this vertex to this vertex has a path, as an edge, but the other way it is not implicit. It is not an undirected graph, right? So given a graph and 2 vertices, we are asking, is there a path from S to T? And your third exercise is to show that this language is in NL. So given a graph and two vertices, directed graph, show that using non-deterministic log space, you can determine whether you can go from S to T. So just think about it, how you may approach this. This is a bit involved than the other two exercises that I gave. So basically, you can use non-determinism, means you can guess some things, right? So what do you want to guess? But again, if you guess something in the case of space constrained situation, how do you, what would you make of, like, would you store it? Because if you store anything, remember this is non-deterministic log space. So even things that you may imagine is very insignificant will require some space, because the constraint is log space only, not even linear space, right? So you have to keep track of your space usage clearly, right? Okay, now we will talk about, let me just see how far we have. Again, we'll talk about reductions, right? We saw polynomial time reductions. Just like that, we can define log space reductions. It is very similar. So we say that A is log space reducible to B, or A reduces to B in log space, denoted by A less than or equal to B with a subscript L. In the case of polynomial time, we had a subscript P. In the case of many one, we had subscript M. Here we have a subscript L. If there is a deterministic log space machine M that computes the function F such that given a string W, it computes the reduction instance FW. So M computes this, and this is the usual rule of the reduction. W is in A if and only if FW is in B. So the only difference between polynomial time reduction and log space reduction is the constraint on the machine. In the polynomial time reduction, we said that the machine should run in polynomial time. Here we are saying the machine should run in log space. Okay, so why did we define log space reduction? This is to define NL completeness, just like something like NP completeness. So B is an NL complete. NL is not deterministic log space again. If and only if first B is in NL, and for all A in NL, A is reducible to B, and A is reducible to B in log space. Okay, so as we already have seen, NL is contained in P, right? NL is contained in P. So we cannot use, you may see why we cannot use polynomial time reductions here, because if A is in NL and I am allowed polynomial time, then I might as well decide A itself. I don't need to reduce to B. So there is no point in kind of reducing from something to something. So basically, whenever you have a complete problem and you are using some reductions to define the complete problem, this reduction should actually be not as powerful as the class itself. So this reduction that we use here, so here the class is NL. The reduction should be less powerful than the entire class. So recall there was an exercise that said that in NP completeness, what happens if you use exponential time reductions? So the point is that if we use exponential time reductions, then everything could be solved, because we could just solve everything in NP in exponential time. Just like that, here it doesn't make sense to use polynomial time reduction, because polynomial time is a stronger class, is a bigger class than NL. So everything in NL can be solved in polynomial time. So for this reduction to make sense, the reduction should have a constraint that is seemingly, at least that is less powerful than the class itself. So that's why we are using the log space reduction, which was the reason for defining log space reduction, right? So you see why the polynomial time reduction does not really work out here, because everything can be just just solved, not even reduced. Okay. Now, a couple of things. I just want you to think before seeing the next video, which I will put out in some time. So in the case of polynomial time reduction, right, what did we do? Given A, we reduced to an instance of B in polynomial time, and then we solved the instance of B in polynomial time. This gave a solution for uh, A in polynomial time. So when A reduced to B in, let's say, n squared time, right? So let's say this reduction took n squared time. Maybe I'll write somewhere else. Let's say this reduction took n squared time, and this B is in P is n cubed time, which means that the output of the reduction could be of length n squared, and this is an n cubed algorithm. So totally this may take n cubed whole power squared or n squared whole cubed or something, so which is like n power 6 time, right? Because it's a composition of these functions. So n power 6 is still polynomial, so it was fine in the case of polynomial time reduction. But given a log space reduction, right? So given an instance of A, W an instance of A, such that W is of length n, what can we say about the length of the reduced length of the transformed instance? So length of FW, what can we say? So we know we are given W, which is of length n. Now we run a reduction machine. We know that the only thing that we can say about the reduction machine is that it takes only log space, right? But recall the output size of the log space. The output size is not counted towards the log space machine. The output size is separate. So given that you restrict the log space machine to log n work tape, what can be the upper bound on the output tape length or output instance length? That's the question. So I want you to think about this before the before seeing the next recording. All right. Thank you.